the redevelopment of the former Kapyong Barracks lands by the Treaty 1 Development Corporation here in my very own neighborhood in River Heights in Winnipeg. I hope you got your handouts ahead of time. If you didn't, we'll make sure we get them to you. This talk should take me around 45 minutes to present. There are 52 slides and they're numbered so you can see how far along I am, and don't get worried that there's a million more to come. Any photos without credits, you can assume they are my own. This is my backyard, a fairly traditional mixed garden with many non-native plants. In recent years, I have added quite a number of native plants. In this talk, I would like to make the argument for including both native and non-native plants in home gardens. Some folks would like us to remove all non-native plants and replace them with natives. I believe, however, that this is likely to turn off many gardeners like me, who are otherwise very open to including native plants, adding them to their gardens. And it also overlooks the valuable ecological roles that many non-native garden cultivars can play. As I will explain, we should definitely add certain native plants as a high priority. The vast majority of this presentation will be about those high priority native plants that we should add. But as I will also explain, most non-invasive garden cultivars can also provide valuable ecological services and are worth keeping. So here are some of my favorite non-native plants. Some of them are related to regional natives, but none would pass the test of native plant purists, who would rather we use only seed-grown descendants of plants that have been here since before European contact. Nevertheless, research and observation tell me that all of these plants still provide a range of important benefits to wildlife, such as insects, soil organisms, birds, and mammals. For example, I have observed plenty of bees, butterflies, and other pollinators using many of my non-native flowers as sources of pollen and nectar. In addition, all of these plants service to one specific organism. I think you can guess which organism, namely me. When I see, touch, smell, taste, or even hear them, that stimulates certain nerve endings and releases chemicals in my brain that cause me to feel delight and joy, as well as a desire to care for these plants so that they grow well and complete their life cycle in the best possible way. This emotional connection is one of the many biological connections between humans as organisms and plants as fellow organisms, and I'm pretty sure you can identify with that. I have found that there are many native plants that are well worth adding to my traditional mixed garden. I have 30 or 40 regional natives growing in community with the rest of my plants. Here are a couple of my favorites, smooth aster and prairie coneflower. And this is Talamy and Dark's definition of a native, which I will follow here. A plant or animal that has evolved in a given space over a period of time sufficient to develop complex and essential relationships with the physical environment and other organisms in a given ecological community. So here are two lists of my native plants, those adapted to sunny prairie and those adapted to woodland. Like many people, I have a small urban yard with a lot of shade from buildings, fences, and trees. For this reason, many sun-loving prairie plants that I've tried have not survived and thrived. I really cannot recreate a grassland on my property, I have discovered. So I've made an effort to learn the more shade-tolerant woodland natives of our ecoregion and to use them where possible. And speaking of shade, here's an important quotation from a leading expert on the prairie ecosystem. Riparian means riverbank. Although riparian forests occupy only about 1% of the region, they provide living space for somewhere between 60 and 90% of the species of vertebrates, reptiles, amphibians, mammals, and birds that occupy the prairies, that occur on the prairies. They have also proven highly attractive to humans, that is, the riparian forests. Most people in our region live in cities or towns near rivers or bodies of water, and most homes are surrounded by trees in the form of urban landscaping or in rural areas, shelter belts. So the riparian forest or mixed woodland is the model in nature that most closely resembles many of our gardens. And it is okay to follow that model because woodlands support not just vertebrates, including us, but also lots of invertebrates, such as beautiful native butterflies. Here's one more plant list. Although I don't have a vegetable garden per se, I do include edible plants in my garden. And these are the ones that I have grown at least once over the last 3 years. None of these are native plants. The raspberries and strawberries may be descended from wild prairie plants, but really these are all cultivated plants that humans have bred over the centuries for our use as food. Manitoba Indigenous peoples also grew plants for food. Even before colonization, they were trading in seeds and roots from elsewhere on the continent, including squash, corn, beans, and Jerusalem artichoke or sunchoke, which is a type of sunflower, Helianthus tuberosus, a type of sunflower from further south of here that is now thought of as a native plant. It was traded in by the indigenous peoples. And they also tended to make their gardens near the rivers, as we do, where the soil was a heck of a lot easier to dig and where they could source water and wood. The river lot system of the Manitoba Métis was also based on the need for access to water and wood. Highlighted here in green is the property of Louis Riel's mother, Julie, on this map of Saint Vital from 1875. The Riel Museum is on a tiny, tiny scrap of this property, which is stretched about 2.5 kilometers all the way from the Red River over to the Seine River. So once again, wood and water access, very, very important to those Métis settlers. My point is that humans have long been part of the ecosystem. They have long been gardeners. They've been at it for a long time. Even before European settlement, we have had a permanent impact on nature, and not all of it negative, over hundreds and hundreds of years. Because we humans are so thoroughly entangled in the natural world, there is no such thing as a perfectly untouched wild world that we can somehow recreate if we try hard enough. To quote the title of the excellent book by Rayner and West, we live in a post-wild world. Certainly in the smaller private spaces where most of us garden, we cannot truly resurrect the tall grass prairie that once was here. We can only create intentional hybrid spaces that are as sustainable and wildlife friendly as possible. To quote Rick Darke from his preface to The Living Landscape, the book he co-authored with the entomologist and environmentalist Douglas Tallamy, in most cases and most places, the design of broadly functional, ecologically sound, resource-conserving residential gardens requires a carefully balanced mix of native and non-native plants. It's time to stop worrying about where those plants come from and instead focus on how they function in today's ecology. After all, it's the only one we have. It's the only ecology we have. So I am a Douglas Tallamy fan. I am convinced by what his research shows, namely that where alien plants have reduced diversity and displaced regional natives, it has seriously impacted insect populations, especially butterflies and moths, whose larvae or caterpillars depend on those native plants as hosts. Since they have evolved together over a long time, the insects cannot easily adapt to new exotic replacement plants. And since many birds depend on caterpillars to feed their chicks, as many as 9,000 caterpillars to feed one brood of chickadees, this has resulted in declining populations of birds. Douglas Tallamy lives in Pennsylvania and works at the University of Delaware, just over the boundary in the state of Delaware. And that is the area where I grew up and where my father had his landscape business. It's the mid-Atlantic region of the eastern U.S., or in terms of ecoregions, the eastern hardwood forest. Tallamy's big enemy there is alien plants, mostly from Asia, that are seriously compromising the local native forests. His list of offenders is long and includes Japanese honeysuckle, kudzu, lantana, European buckthorn, oriental bittersweet, purple loosestrife, Norway maple, English ivy, Japanese knotweed, Bradford pear, barberry, and wisteria. Excuse me. Now, 3 of those are a problem here in Manitoba. Purple loosestrife, Japanese knotweed, and buckthorn, European buckthorn. For example, the woods in Assiniboine Park are infested with European buckthorn. The other exotics in Talamy's list are either not hardy here or not a problem, at least not so far. We have a different set of invasive exotics here, which you can find on the website of the Invasive Species Council of Manitoba. Their website is at the bottom of your screen. No, I don't think we should demonize these species. I mean, it's not really their fault that they're here, but I do think we should familiarize ourselves with them and remind people that it's just better not to use them in our gardens. Interestingly enough, some invasive exotics like Canada thistle and toadflax, lower right there, actually do support pollinators, but they do tend to outcompete other plants, both native and non-native. Then, of course, remember the main reason why less than 1% of the original tallgrass prairie is left: agriculture. I don't think we want to call our food crops alien exotics, but farmland is what has most impacted the original prairie habitat. The hundreds of millions of acres of industrial farms that now cover the central plains of this continent. When the pioneers came, they literally broke the prairie. That's what they talked about doing. and it's pretty hard to bring back when you break something. However, we depend on farms for our food. And as long as that is the case, the only thing we can really do is show our willingness to maybe pay a little bit more for food that is produced in more ecologically sustainable ways. But you know what? That's a different topic, and I'm not going to pursue it any further here. So alien exotics include not just invasives like European buckthorn, but also ornamentals from Asia, like those pink azaleas in the foundation planting you see, and that huge expanse of non-native suburban lawn grass. These do almost nothing to support native pollinators. And this landscape is too simplified to attract other beneficial insects that can keep pests under control. That's why lawns and shrubs out east get attacked by pests like Japanese beetles. So what Talamy is calling for is a much more complex, diverse mix of native and non-native plants that will support a diverse range of wildlife throughout the season. As a result, there will be lots more caterpillars for feeding baby birds, but not too many, right? Because the birds and also the predatory wasps and flies that feed on the caterpillars will keep all of those numbers in balance. Now, the key species for Talamy are the Lepidoptera, the butterflies and moths, because of the importance of their caterpillars in the food web. In order for them to lay their eggs and produce larvae, they need the host plants that they are adapted to, the plants that their larvae can eat once they hatch. The most familiar example of this is, of course, the monarch butterfly. The monarch is endangered because farming and development have led to the disappearance of milkweed, the only food for its larvae, and it has no plan B. It seems likely we can help the monarchs if enough of us plant native milkweeds. The question is now, are there other Lepidoptera species here in our region that we can help by providing their host plants in our gardens? As it happens, there is a tool we can use to find out. The National Wildlife Federation in the U.S. has set up an online database called the Native Plant Finder. The URL is at the bottom of your screen. It's also on your resource list. If you enter a zip code, for example, 58271 for Pembina, North Dakota, which is just 100 kilometers south of here, you then get 2 lists of the top local native host plants for butterflies and moths. And Talamy is actually involved, his research is involved in this. One list shows trees and shrubs, the other shows flowers and grasses, ranked in order by the number of butterfly and moth species that use them as host plants for their caterpillars. So here are the lists for Pembina, zip code 58271. You can see that among flowers and grasses, the top ones are goldenrod, strawberry, sunflower, and deer vetch, lotus there, and then violet after that. And the top trees and shrubs are cherry or plum, prunus species, willow, and aspen or poplar. poplar, sorry. If you click on the genus name, you get the native species within that genus, local native species within that genus, along with the butterflies and moths that they support. So if I click on, say, Fraxinus ash, I get a list of different butterflies and moths that ash support, that use ash trees as host. And here you see the first five, 3 kinds of sphinx moths and 2 kinds of butterfly, one of which we have fairly commonly here, the mourning cloak. So I made tables out of the lists from this tool. And on this table, which shows the top tree and shrub Lepidoptera host, notice the huge numbers of Lepidoptera that use our regional native trees. All right, so 168, 162, 141, and so on, all the way down. And then here are the flowers and grass Lepidoptera hosts for Pembina. If you look at the numbers that they support, I've left out 1 or 2 genera that have no local native species, but this is pretty close to what you find on the website. You notice that while these flowers and grasses also host many butterflies and moths, they are not nearly as important hosts as the trees and shrubs when it comes to the sheer number of species that they support. So here's the tree list again, so you can see the numbers there. I have checked both of those tables, trees and shrubs and flowers and grasses, against the listings in other references like Simon Allard's Manitoba Butterflies, a field guide, Laurie Bell's Lepidoptera and host spreadsheet. These high numbers seem to be quite correct, and they can be explained by the fact that most moths use trees and shrubs as their hosts. Moth larvae are just as important as butterfly larvae to the ecosystem. They make caterpillars too, and that's bird food. The implication for us here is that the biggest threats to Lepidoptera in our area are the pests and diseases that are threatening our native trees. We should try to get local government to put more resources towards tree maintenance and replacement if we care about the biosphere here. And on top of this, I would add, as native plant enthusiasts, we really shouldn't be neglecting our trees and shrubs. Woodlands are an important part of the prairie ecosystem. Think about the importance of woody plants to pollinators and add that layer to your garden if you have room. You might have room for a cherry or a plum, a willow, a native spirea, or a sumac. All of those are hosts for butterflies and moths. Also the dogwoods and viburnums, which are smaller understory shrubs, and native vines like Virginia creeper. Those are happy in shade, the understory shrubs, and many of the native vines are just fine in a little bit of shade or even a lot of shade. Using the Manitoba Butterflies Field Guide left and the book Naturescape Manitoba, and also a very good list on the Nature North website, I put together a table of host plants for common Manitoba butterflies, and most of you have received it already if you are registered for this webinar. Please note that these plant-insect relationships on the table, on the chart, are very region-specific. They are very Manitoba-specific. If you live somewhere else and are joining us tonight from somewhere outside of Manitoba where you make your home, the host plants and butterflies will be different, and you'll need to find a good field guide for your own area. And there should be plenty for all different geographic regions in North America. So here's the table that you were sent, just the top half. As I said, many butterflies use trees or shrubs for their host, as do almost all moths. Also, many butterflies use common weeds. So here at the top of the table, I put the host plants that are not trees and not common weeds, but plants that we can easily provide in our gardens. And I've limited the butterfly species to those that have a reasonable chance of showing up in a garden in Manitoba, according to University of Winnipeg expert Dr. Richard Westwood. Rare and endangered prairie species like the Poweshiek skipperling are not listed here because, unfortunately, they generally require complex natural habitats that cannot be duplicated in gardens. I have this from him. And this is a reference list that I thought you might find useful and would like to keep around. Not sure if I should comment on it extensively. Maybe if you have questions on it later, we can go over them. It's a bit of a long list, and my purpose here is to talk about the high priority host plants that you should provide in your garden, that you can provide in your garden. So what are the ones that are most important to add? Here's a simplified list. These are what I would call high priority butterfly host plants. If you don't already have these plants, these are the ones I would say you should add to your garden first. Native species are your safest bet, but in some cases, butterflies have adapted to using non-natives as well. It's not a long list. So, for example, black swallowtails do not necessarily need native Alexanders for their caterpillars. If you have carrots, parsnips, celery, or a long list of herbs, angelica, anise, chervil, cilantro, cumin, dill, fennel, lovage, parsley, all on the table you were sent. And by the way, the blooms of these plants, called umbels, are abundant nectar and pollen sources for all kinds of beneficial insects. Bees, as well as that syrphid fly or hoverfly that you see in the center, which not only feeds on pollen and nectar, also feeds on aphids. So this is a guy you want to have around to actually control pests in your garden. To attract these kinds of beneficial insects, let your herbs bloom. Or plant grocery store carrots for Queen Anne's lace style flowers. Just have to take a carrot out of the bag from your fridge and plant it, and soon you will have flowers that look just like those in the center picture. In the legume family, wild pea vine is very pretty and quite shade tolerant, but the white clover in your lawn is also a legume. Eastern and western tailed blue butterflies and others will use it as an alternate host. Clover, early blue violets, and plantain are all butterfly hosts. And if your lawn is anything like mine, I have a bit of a lawn in the front yard. There's plenty of them growing in the lawn, and you shouldn't get rid of them because they are very, very useful to the insects and butterflies. I have been talking about host plants, and I'm hoping everybody understands what a host plant is. Host plants for butterflies, that is the plants whose foliage they absolutely must have for their larvae to feed on. And this is different from providing flowers with nectar to feed adult butterflies and moths. In this respect, butterflies and moths are much less specialized. They are usually glad to take nectar from any number of native and non-native annual and perennial flowers. Here you see a fritillary on swamp milkweed flowers, a black swallowtail on the Delphinium cultivar royal aspirations, and a monarch nectarine on Echinacea purpurea magnus. Only the milkweed is a native plant. In a pesticide-free garden, mind you, it has to be a pesticide-free garden, you will observe butterflies nectaring on all kinds of plants. And the same holds true for bees. Like adult butterflies, most bees, including honeybees and our native bumblebees, are not fussy where they collect their nectar and pollen. They are generalists. However, there are some native bees that are specialists, and they can only feed on the pollen and nectar of certain native plants. It's not a long list, but if we are aware of it, we can help them by adding the flowers that they need to our gardens. Now, here are the hosts for Manitoba's specialist bees. Another table you were sent. This is based on various sources, including input from Dr. Jason Gibbs, the bee expert at the University of Manitoba. Some comments. Remember, it's the nectar and especially the protein-rich pollen that the bees are after. So you want to ensure there are lots and lots of flowers all through the season. If you plant the harebells and alum root, I do not actually know whether you will attract the single bee species that relies on each of them, but they're both really nice plants, and it really can't hurt to plant them. So these are, again, your high priority host plants, this time for bees. If we leave aside, then, the host plants that are already abundant, such as common weeds and trees, this is the short list we get for bees, butterflies, and moths. These are the native plants suitable for gardens that are needed as hosts by butterflies and bees. The moths generally use trees. I think on the handout I mentioned a couple of other species that aren't trees that moths use, but really these are the ones that we want to worry about are butterflies and bee species, native butterflies and bee species. This list of plants will cover most specialist pollinator needs that are not covered elsewhere. Of course, there are lots of other beautiful wildflowers that pollinators will really appreciate for their pollen and nectar. And I'm not saying you shouldn't plant those as well, but these are the high priority host plants where you should start, especially if you're just beginning to plant native plants in your yard. These are the ones where the insects have no other choice, or not many other choices in terms of what they or their larvae can eat. So alexanders, alumroot, asters, goldenrods, harebells, milkweed, native legumes such as morpha, milkvetch, purple prairie clover, and wild peavine, sunflowers, violets, grasses. Okay, so now some photos of these high priority hosts. Golden alexanders and the slightly smaller heartleaf alexanders are really beautiful early blooming plants. They can be used in any garden. They go with anything. Look at that sort of nice understated greeny yellow, and it goes really well with blue, as you can see with the Verbena hastata behind. They are hosts for black swallowtails and a species of mining bee, but also very popular as a nectar plant. In my yard, the black swallowtail larvae love my parsley more than they like the alexanders, but as garden plants go, this is probably a nicer addition than just some parsley. Alumroot is our indigenous heuchera or coral bells. It's dense but compact with interesting greenish tan flowers. If you have trouble overwintering the heucheras with all the fancy colored leaves, red and gold and whatever, and they all die on you over the winter, try this one. It's totally hardy, dead hardy, and also quite tolerant of shade or semi-shade. I really recommend it, especially if you need something just to sort of fill in areas where there's bare soil. Every prairie garden should have asters, no question. They are extremely important for bees in late summer when they're gathering their reserves for winter and for their larvae, and there are many asters to choose from. Most asters do best in full sun, but flat top and New England aster will tolerate a little bit of shade. Not a lot, but a little bit of shade. This New England aster on the right is in Assiniboine Park and the new development area of Assiniboine Park. And it seems to be a selection of the native plant that blooms a bit longer and is in a deeper shade of purple. It was very beautiful when we saw it in September. Goldenrods, believe it or not, are in the daisy family and closely related to asters. They bloom at the same time, and there are bees that need asters or goldenrods or both as a specialist pollen source. There are many nice goldenrod species. This is one of them, showy goldenrod. Check our friends' nursery catalogs to see some others. Harebells are another important pollen and nectar plant with a long bloom period, also known as Scotch bellflowers. They can be found in all the northern countries of the world: Scotland, Scandinavia, Siberia, Canada, and very easy to add to your garden. They don't take a lot of space, and they're very pretty. There are at least 3 species of milkweed that work well in gardens: swamp milkweed, dwarf, and world milkweed. All are fairly compact, and they do not spread. On the other hand, common milkweed and showy milkweed, which is actually not all that showy, will tend to get out of control in a small garden like mine. If you have an acreage, on the other hand, then, go nuts. It's probably safe to let them do their thing there. But I really recommend swamp milkweed as a bright addition, worthy addition to any garden at all. And very soon you will see it covered with larvae, monarch larvae. Here are some wildflowers in the legume family. Wild peavine is the only one I know of that is shade tolerant in the center there. Prairie Flora is a nursery that carries it. That's where I got mine. The genus Amorpha includes 3 smaller shrubs, lead plant, indigo bush, and dwarf false indigo. Well, lead plant isn't that small, but indigo bush, dwarf false indigo are amorphas that you can grow if you have full sun. Very pretty purple flowers, and you can tell it's kind of in the pea family or related to the vetches. Purple prairie clover is hot pink, one of the brightest of the wildflowers, prairie wildflowers, and it is an essential flower host for several specialist bees. So absolutely something you should consider including. Sunflowers. Sunflowers are host for silvery checker spot butterflies and a flower host for many of the native bees. There are many native bees that are specialized in sunflowers. This species here, Maximiliani, and other native perennial sunflowers will work very well, but also many of the annual sunflowers that you can grow from just a seed packet. What you have to make sure of is that they are not bred to be pollenless. Some people grow sunflowers as cut flowers and they don't want pollen all over their tablecloth. So if you look carefully at your seed packet, make sure that it doesn't say that they are pollenless for obvious reasons. That's of no use to the bees. You'll need violets if you want to support most fritillary butterflies, although apparently the larvae will eat your pansy foliage as well. Don't be alarmed. However, the adult butterflies prefer violets for nectaring. These are really nice for your shady spots. Western Canada violet is the white one, tends to seed itself fairly enthusiastically, but these two are just very sweet, well-behaved, lovely little violets that cheer you up in the spring when they show up. Just great for shady spots. And finally, the native grasses are important additions to our gardens. Grasses are pollinated by the wind and do not produce nectar. However, their pollen apparently can still be used by some bees. Their pollen is often quite abundant because it is wind pollinated. And the foliage of the grasses also serves as host and habitat for a number of butterflies as well as birds and mammals. If you have a shady garden, I recommend purple oatgrass. That's the one in the lower left. The only native grass that, in my experience, will do okay in shade. And it is host to northern pearly-eyed butterflies. So purple oatgrass, my tip when it comes to grasses. Cytodes grama, Canada wild rye, and sheep fescue will apparently tolerate some shade. But otherwise, prairie grasses want the full sun of the open prairie, in my experience. So please remember that the short list that I showed you represents the high priority host plants. You don't have to plant just those. There are lots of other attractive pollen and nectar-rich wildflowers that are worth growing to, like the ones you see here. Remember that I said our native bumblebees are not specialists and not fussy as to their nectar and pollen sources. The same is true for the vast majority of other native bees, including many sweat bees, mason bees, and leafcutter bees that may overwinter in our gardens in the soil or in cavities or dead stems. Make sure that you provide that kind of habitat for them if you want them to stick around. In the spring, blossoming fruit trees of all kinds, native and non-native, are especially important for generalist bees. Later, they are content to feed on the nectar and pollen of many non-native plants like these, zinnias and goat's beard on the right. Notice, if you look closely, how the bumblebee on the goat's beard has filled her pollen basket. That's that yellow blob on the side of bumblebee. Pollen basket has a mixture of nectar and pollen that she stuffs in there to carry back to her nest. Goat's beard is not native to here, but to eastern North America. The non-native plants in your garden will often be garden cultivars. That is, cultivated varieties. It's short for cultivated variety. Cultivated varieties that have been selected and or bred for particular desirable characteristics. Some cultivars were discovered just discovered as natural variants in the wild. Others have resulted from selective breeding within the species, while others come from hybrid crosses with related species. Plant variations are actually quite frequent in nature, and hybridization can also occur in nature. And, there are many reasons to choose a cultivar. For example, bigger or brighter flowers, resistance to mildew, or what concerns us here, their attractiveness to pollinators. How can we tell if a given cultivar can feed a local pollinator? Well, you can't always find out from the plant tag or from the internet. We need more research. The research is only just beginning. More objective research. Just marketing is all we've got so far, really, in many cases. And, we also need to make our own careful observations. We are all capable of being citizen scientists when it comes to this. However, there are a couple of characteristics that can help us tell when a plant will not be able to support pollinators. What are some of the characteristics that can warn us maybe this is not going to be a good support to pollinators? First of all, sterility. That is, the flower produces no fertile pollen or seeds. Examples include Karl Forster feather reedgrass, completely sterile, pollenless sunflowers, as I mentioned, that have been bred for cut flower use, and most hydrangeas. The reason they are so beautiful for such a long time is that their flowers are, generally speaking, sterile. They're not programmed to make seeds. However, according to Dr. Philip Ronald of Jeffries Nurseries, there are a couple of hydrangeas that do have some pollen-bearing flowers that if you care about this, you should choose those. Quickfire, Pinky Winky, Limericky. Unlikely that double flowers, less likely that double flowers will support pollinators because double flowers are usually the result of mutations where the petals have replaced some or all of the stamens, which of course affects pollen production. And also with double flowers, pollinators often can't recognize or find the nectar source. So, look inside your flowers. Just poke around in them. If you don't find those yellow anthers with pollen on them, the bees aren't going to find them either. Make sure that you find the yellow anthers inside your flowers so that you're sure that they will be of use to the pollinators. Purple or red foliage, another sign that maybe not so good for pollinators, not so good for insects. Douglas Tallamy's research has shown that when green leaves have been changed by breeding to red or purple, the anthocyanin pigments consistently deter insect feeding. For example, choke cherries with green leaves can host hair-streak butterfly caterpillars, but choke cherries with purple leaves can't. They deter insect feeding, in other words. On the other hand, interestingly enough, variegated foliage, like on dogwoods, Siberian dogwoods, for example, doesn't seem to make any difference at all. It's red foliage, purple foliage that you should be concerned about. And finally, for obvious reasons, significantly earlier or later bloom periods than the native species. They're not going to be as good for your pollinator friends. Be aware that when a plant tag or website says that a plant is quote-unquote native, that could refer to a different ecoregion, like Eastern North America, where bigger population and they're marketing to a whole lot more people than us. Same thing goes when the tag says it attracts pollinators. Well, whose pollinators where? We don't know for sure until we try it here. So no guarantees, but a cultivar is more likely to be able to feed our local pollinators if it is, first of all, a non-hybridized selection of a local native. Examples include named Little Blue Stem, Blue Heaven, or the Blues, lavender flowered selections of Culber's Root. A student of Tallamy's did research on the cultivar lavender towers and found that it was actually more attractive to pollinators than the white-flowered native species. But this was in Vermont. Remember, Vermont is not here. Once again, eastern hardwood forest is not here. We have to do our own observations. More likely to support local pollinators if it's a hybrid with the prairie native in its parentage. Examples are the Monarda or bee balm cultivars. For example, Marshall's Delight. There are quite a few others. That was bred with one of his parents, the wild bergamot, Monarda fistulosa. And the Morden corabels, Brandon Pink being a really good example. Its parent, Henry Marshall, used alum root, Heuchera richardsonii, to breed that one. If those native plants are in the parentage of a cultivar, chances are it's going to be attractive. Its flowers are going to be attractive to pollinators here as well. Quite often you can buy garden cultivars that are an Eastern North American native or a cultivar of the same. For example, the echinaceas you buy in the garden centers are generally Echinacea purpurea, Magnus being an old-fashioned cultivar, has been around for a long time. Our native species is Echinacea angustifolia. Many of the echinaceas have been bred to be double, so don't buy those if you want to attract pollinators. They don't have nectar and pollen. But the older cultivars, I have seen pollinators on them, including my own Echinacea magnus. The eastern Liatris, the eastern blazing star, is Liatris spicata, one cultivar kobold. Our native blazing star species are Liatris punctata and ligustylus. So, the eastern Liatris may well work. Finally, if you look at the plant, if you look at the flower and you see that it has abundant and accessible pollen and nectar, chances are it's going to be good for pollinators. Examples include lilacs, speedwells, any of the alliums, ornamental onions. Many annuals are attractive to pollinators, have plenty of pollen and nectar for them. If you go to Be Better Manitoba's website, it has a really nice list of non-native pollinator plants, which include alyssum, calendula, cannas, cleome, cosmos, globe amaranth, heliotrope, lobelia, marigolds, nasturtiums, purslane, annual sunflowers, mentioned those already, verbena, and zinnias. We just need more comparative observations, and I would love to hear from you if you make some interesting observations. Dr. Wilbert Ronald of Jeffries Nurseries, who worked at the Morden Research Stations for many years, tells me that the Morden monardas, or bee bombs, are very attractive to bees. She saw it all the time. If those cultivars are as popular with pollinators as the prairie bergamot, Monarda fistulosa, which you see on the left, we may want to choose them because they were bred to be more resistant to powdery mildew. Plant trials at the Mount Cuba Center in Delaware, where Douglas Tallamy collaborates, have found that the Morden monardas do attract tons of pollinators, but had better mildew resistance than the native Monarda fistulosa. However, we need to do our own research. This is Delaware. Delaware is a different ecozone. A recent UK study called Plants for Bugs found that, quote, regardless of plant origin, native or non-native, the more flowers a garden can offer throughout the year, the greater the number of bees, hoverflies, and other pollinating insects it will attract and support. Again, we have to do our own research, our own local research, but broadly speaking, my observations support this. A diverse mix of native and non-native plants can offer lots of nectar and pollen throughout the season to non-specialist pollinators, as well as providing habitat and many other ecological services to insects and other wildlife. This is Pete Oudoff's naturalistic garden, which models how to create a plant community that is both beautiful and ecological. To summarize then, if we agree that habitat loss threatens native pollinators, it seems reasonable to try to help them by incorporating certain native plants into our gardens while minimizing plantings that provide little or no food and habitat. High priority native plants are those that are exclusive larval hosts for regional Lepidoptera or exclusive floral hosts for regional specialist bees, and that are not otherwise abundant. And in terms of size and growth pattern, they should be suitable for gardens. And I've tried to give you lists of such plants. What remains are the in-between plants that many of us love. The ones that are not hosts to specific butterflies and bees, but they're also not invasive or sterile exotics. That still leaves quite a few. We can observe for ourselves the pollinator activity on them. Moreover, we can see for ourselves that almost all plants, including most non-native plants, have useful foliage, flowers, fruits, roots, and living tissue that can benefit wildlife as well as Homo sapiens. Simply by growing plants and avoiding chemicals, we are contributing positively to the living environment. Consider all the ecological services that are provided by all plants, whether they are native or non-native. Thank you for listening. I have one little ad to put up at the end here at the request of the Master Gardeners. I thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to take questions. It looks like there are quite a few. Shall I stop sharing my screen? What do you think?
I don't think so, because
might want to go back?
Yeah, I think we might want to go back to a couple of them. Sure. First of all, Linda, thanks for a fantastic and information-rich presentation. Any one of these slides.
I really didn't want it to be too dense.
No, I think it, for myself, I think it was absolutely wonderful. I would like to go back to slides that you presented on pages, I think it was 22 and 23.
Uh-oh. Oh. I didn't mean to share it. Oh, well, I'll share the screen again, but I'll have to do the thing where I see the sidebar. There we go.
Yeah.
Now, what's the number again, please?
22, I think.
22.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see here.
And the one that I was particularly interested in, I guess in part because of the work that I and some others have been doing with municipalities, is the 21 and 22, the top trees and shrubs, yep, and the top flowers and grasses. In part because you've already gone to a terrific amount of work to gather that information. And just wondering if that is something that you would consider sharing, just because of the numbers you had there. You had some other good summary slides strictly for flowers and grasses. But
sure.
I'm thinking,
this is not my data, right? This is taken off of that website that I showed you earlier. This one, the Native Plant Finder. This is based on Talamy and colleagues' data for Pembina, North Dakota.
But what you've done is you've taken that information from the native plants list and you've looked at them specifically for ones that are native to our region.
Yeah.
That's the work. And
I took